The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The morning that opened this story was not sudden. It had been building for years. The United States was growing fast, but it was not growing together. In some states, slavery was lawful and deeply woven into farms and business. In other states, people had ended slavery and wanted it to fade from the nation. Each year the disagreement grew louder. New territories became states, and Congress argued whether those new states would allow slavery or not. Compromises were tried. Lines were drawn on maps. Speeches promised peace. Yet underneath the words, worry spread. By 1860, many people felt the country could not hold both ways at once. In that year, Americans voted for a new president. Abraham Lincoln was elected on a platform that opposed the spread of slavery into the Western territories. He did not call for ending slavery where it already existed. Even so, leaders in several southern states believed their future and safety were at risk. One by one, beginning with South Carolina, they voted to leave the Union. They formed a new government called the Confederate States of America and chose Jefferson Davis as their president. Federal forts and customs houses in the South became points of tension. Neighbors watched neighbors and wondered what would happen next. The first shots came at Fort Sumter, a brick fort guarding the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. It was April 1861. The Confederacy demanded the fort's surrender. The U.S. garrison, short on supplies, held on. Confederate guns opened fire. Cannon smoke drifted across the water. After a day and a half of bombardment, the fort lowered its flag. No one died in the battle, but the event changed everything. The North rallied to the flag. The South settled into its new purpose. Lincoln called for volunteers to put down the rebellion. More states joined the Confederacy. Brothers in border families found themselves on different sides. At first, many people thought the war would be short. Young men in uniforms marched with bright eyes. Bands played. Towns held send-offs and promised to welcome their soldiers home by Christmas. Reality came slowly, then all at once. The first big clash near Manassas, known in the North as Bull Run, turned crowded roads into chaos. Civilians who had come to watch found themselves caught in dust and fear as the lines broke. Both sides learned that courage was not enough. Training, supply, maps, and leaders mattered. The war would be long. The country divided not just on maps but in daily life. In the North, factories turned to war work. They made rifles, cloth, shoes, tents, wagons, and rails. Farms sent wheat and corn by the ton. In the South, cotton and tobacco fields continued, but blockades and shortages began to bite. The Confederate government tried to build an army from scattered workshops and imported goods. Women in both regions stepped into new roles, managing farms, running shops, nursing the wounded, and organizing relief. Children learned to live with letters instead of fathers at the table. Armies formed and moved. In the East, the main Union Army under General George McClellan drilled near Washington, D.C. Across the lines, General Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan was careful, sometimes too careful. He shaped a fine force and planned complex operations but often held back when boldness was needed. Lee was daring. He trusted his lieutenants and moved fast when he saw an opening. The ground between the capitals became familiar: the rivers, the fords, the roads that curved through woods and fields. In the West, along the Mississippi and deep into Tennessee, Kentucky, and beyond, another story unfolded. There, Union generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman pushed toward the river that split the continent. Control of the Mississippi meant control of supply and movement. Early in the war, Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Unconditional surrender became his nickname after he accepted nothing less at Donelson. The fighting at Shiloh soon showed that Western battles would be as hard as any in the East. The fields were left silent except for the calls of wounded men. Leaders on both sides realized that this war would demand more than they had ever imagined. Life in camp shaped the months between battles. Soldiers learned to march long distances with packs that rubbed their shoulders raw. They learned to pitch tents in rain and cold, to boil coffee in blackened tins, and to sew patches with clumsy fingers. Letters home were a lifeline. Paper was precious, but words were more so. A soldier would sit by a low fire, writing by firelight about food, weather, and longing. In return, a small envelope from a far town could brighten a whole week. Diseases, measles, dysentery, typhoid, were common and deadly. Poor water and close quarters did their own cruel work. Doctors did what they could with what they had. Nurses learned quickly and gave comfort with steady hands. Battles came like storms. In the summer of 1862, the 7 days around Richmond showed Lee's skill and the cost of bold attacks. In August, another clash at Manassas ended with the Union Army pulling back again. In September, Lee carried the war into the North, hoping European powers might recognize the Confederacy if he won on Northern soil. The two armies met near a creek called Antietam in Maryland. The day was the single bloodiest in American history. Cornfields, a sunken road, and a stone bridge became places of legend and grief. When the guns paused, neither side had a crushing victory, but Lee withdrew. The Union had held. President Lincoln had been waiting for such a moment. He believed the war's cause would be clearer if it was linked to ending slavery. He had already drafted a proclamation. After Antietam, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and on January 1, 1863, the final order took effect. It declared enslaved people in the rebelling states to be free. It did not end slavery everywhere, but it changed the war's meaning. It told the world that the Union fought not only to keep the nation together but also to break the chains that held millions. It also allowed black men to serve in the Union Army and Navy. They came forward in great numbers. The United States colored troops formed regiments that proved their courage under fire. The 54th Massachusetts is one of the best known. In an attack on Fort Wagner near Charleston, they led the charge across sand and storm. Many fell, including their young colonel, Robert Gould Shaw. The assault failed, but the bravery of the men was clear to all who saw and heard. Across the front, black soldiers built fortifications, guarded rail lines, and fought in major battles. They faced danger in combat and harsh treatment when captured, yet they held their ground with quiet strength. Not all fighting happened in large fields. Along rivers and coasts, iron ships steamed into a new era. The clash of the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, also known as the Merrimack, showed that wooden navies were passing away. The battle ended without a clear winner, but the lesson was firm. Armor and steam would shape seas to come. Meanwhile, the Union Navy tightened a blockade around southern ports, squeezing the Confederacy's access to goods from abroad. Blockade runners raced on dark nights, low in the water and fast. Some slipped through. Many did not. In the winter of 1862, the Union tried to cross the Rappahannock River and take the heights at Fredericksburg. Stone walls and well-placed guns shattered the attack. The snow fell on still bodies in blue. In spring 1863, at Chancellorsville, Lee split his smaller army and sent Stonewall Jackson on a sweeping march that surprised the Union flank. It was a remarkable victory for the Confederates, but it came with tragedy. Jackson was shot by his own men in the dark and died days later. The South lost a gifted commander. The North replaced leaders again, and the war ground on. That summer, the war reached a turning point in two places at once. In the East, Lee moved north again. The Union Army, now under George Meade, followed. They met around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the first 3 days of July. The first day saw hard fighting in fields and along ridges. The second day, the battle widened. Names like Little Round Top, the wheat field, and the peach orchard entered the nation's memory. On the third day, Lee sent a long line across open ground toward the Union center in what became known as Pickett's Charge. Cannon and rifle fire cut the gray ranks down. The attack failed. Lee withdrew, and the North had its clear victory. In the West, Grant completed the long campaign to take Vicksburg, the river fortress that kept the Mississippi split. After months of maneuver and siege, the city surrendered on July 4, 1863. The river was now fully in Union hands, and the Confederacy was cut in two. The twin events, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, shifted the war's tide. The fighting continued, but the path toward Union victory became clearer. Life on the home front reflected the war's strain. In the North, factories ran day and night. Women in cities worked in arsenals, rolling cartridges and sewing uniforms. Sanitary commissions organized supplies and urged better camp hygiene to reduce disease. In the South, the blockade caused shortages of salt, cloth, and even paper. Bread riots broke out in some cities as prices soared. Families in both regions waited for news. Church bells rang when regiments returned, and then fell quiet as lists of casualties were read. Town squares filled to hear speeches after victories and to mourn after losses. Medicine advanced under pressure. Field hospitals learned to sort the wounded quickly. Amputations, as terrible as they were, saved lives when infection would have killed. Anesthesia was more common than many people today assume. Surgeons used chloroform and ether when they could. Nurses, many of them women who had never left home before, learned to clean wounds, change dressings, and give comfort with kindness and order. The war also saw the birth of organized ambulance services and dedicated hospital trains. These systems would not end with the war. They would improve care afterward. Prison camps were another hard part of the story. When prisoner exchanges broke down, camps on both sides swelled. At places like Andersonville in Georgia and Elmira in New York, overcrowding, poor shelter, and scarce food led to suffering and death. Survivors remembered those months as a separate war within the war. After peace returned, the memory of prison life stayed with them like a shadow that lengthened at dusk. Through 1864, General Grant, now commander of all Union armies, rode east to face Lee directly. Grant believed in constant pressure and coordinated action. He told his officers that the Union's larger numbers and resources would count if they kept moving. The overland campaign began in the tangled woods of the wilderness, where brush fires burned among the wounded. It continued at Spotsylvania, where men fought at close range behind earthworks and logs in rain and mud. It reached Cold Harbor, where a frontal attack brought terrible loss in minutes. Grant did not break Lee in the open. Instead, he crossed the James River and began to encircle Petersburg, a rail hub south of Richmond. Trench lines grew for miles, and the war took on a grinding, siege-like rhythm. In the West, Sherman took Atlanta after a long summer of flanking marches and persistent battles. The capture of the city in September 1864 changed the mood of the North. Lincoln faced a difficult election that fall. War weariness was real. Many feared the fighting would never end. News of Atlanta's fall, and of continued Union advances, lifted hopes. Lincoln won re-election, and the war's course held steady. Sherman then set out on his march to the sea, cutting deeper into the Confederacy's heartland. His men destroyed rail lines, burned military stores, and took food to feed the army. The goal was not senseless ruin but the breaking of the South's ability to support its armies. The march showed that Confederate defenses were thin and that the end was approaching. During this time, Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg to dedicate a soldier's cemetery. His address was short, just a few lines, but it placed the war's meaning in simple words. The nation was testing whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people could endure. He asked the living to be dedicated to the unfinished work of freedom and union. People standing there may not have known how long those words would last, but they felt the quiet strength in them. By early 1865, the Confederacy was running out of men and supplies. Across the lines, the Union had learned the patience of siege and the power of railroads and rivers. In April, after long months around Petersburg, Grant's forces finally broke through. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was evacuated. Fires burned as warehouses were abandoned. Lincoln walked through the city quietly a short time later, greeted by newly freed people who saw in him the symbol of a long-awaited change. Lee's army tried to move west to join other forces, but the Union blocked the way. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee met Grant in a small house. The two men spoke with calm and respect. Terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would stack their arms and go home. Officers could keep their sidearms and horses. The point was peace, not humiliation. The war's military end did not end sorrow. Just days after Appomattox, President Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington and died the next morning. The city, and then the nation, learned the news in waves of grief. His body was carried by train through many towns so people could say goodbye. Flags hung at half-staff. Church bells tolled. The man whose steady hand had guided the Union through its hardest years was gone just when he was needed to guide its healing. New leaders would try, but none had quite his mix of patience, firmness, and compassion. When the guns fell silent, the country faced questions that were large and practical. How would the Southern states return to the Union? How would the millions of people who had been enslaved build free lives? How would farms and towns be rebuilt? How would anger be eased? Congress and the new president, Andrew Johnson, struggled over answers. Laws and amendments began to shape a new legal landscape. The 13th Amendment ended slavery across the nation. The 14th promised citizenship and equal protection under the laws. The 15th sought to protect the right to vote regardless of race. On paper, the steps were clear. On the ground, progress was uneven and often blocked by violence and new forms of discrimination. Reconstruction would be its own long, hard story. For veterans, the return to daily life took time. Uniforms were put away. Fields were planted again. Tools were picked up. Shops reopened. Men who had marched hundreds of miles found that walking a furrow with a plow demanded a different kind of strength. For families who had lost someone, the empty chair at the table did not fill. They kept letters, photographs, and a few small items, a cap badge, a button, a book stained with rain. Cemeteries grew quiet and orderly. On certain days, People came with flowers to lay on graves. New customs of remembrance began, acts of respect that would pass to children and then to their children after them. The war had changed technology and industry. Railroads had grown longer and more reliable, telegraph lines had made news travel at a new speed. Mass production of uniforms, rations, and weapons had shown how factories could supply a nation at scale. These changes would shape business for years. Medicine, too, held lessons: clean water, better sanitation, organized hospitals, trained nurses, and treatment systems that saved more lives than before. Even after peace, people remembered what worked and tried to keep it. The country also changed in how it saw itself. Before the war, many people spoke of the Union as something separate from daily life. After the war, the word nation felt more personal. People who had never traveled more than a few miles from home had marched and ridden through several states. They had seen rivers and mountains they had only read about. They had met people from other places and learned their songs and sayings. They understood that the map was not just lines. It was places filled with families like theirs. The ache of the war did not fade quickly. Veterans gathered in groups to share memories. They told stories of hard marches made bearable by a joke, of fires that warmed both friend and foe on winter picket lines, of small kindnesses shown after battles when canteens were shared and letters for the dying were taken up gently. They argued about strategies and leaders and then let the arguments go. They stood at parades with caps held to their chests and found comfort in the presence of those who understood without much saying. Museums and memorials began to rise. In town squares, statues of soldiers at rest were placed on pedestals. In large cities, arches and columns were built to honor all who served. In the South, families tended graves first in private ways, then at larger events. In the North, Decoration Day took shape, a day to decorate graves with flowers. Over time, this day would become Memorial Day. The purpose was simple and tender: to remember, to grieve, and to be grateful. When people talk about the Civil War, they often name big battles and famous generals. Those names matter. But the war also lived in small places, in a field where a fence was mended after troops passed through, in a kitchen where cornmeal stretched to feed extra mouths, in a schoolroom where a teacher tried to explain the meaning of new laws, in a church where a hymn sounded a little different because the pews held new faces. The war's end was not a single moment. It was a long series of choices by millions of people to keep going, to build, and to hope. Think for a moment about a quiet evening in late 1865. A farmer in Ohio sets down a newspaper and steps onto his porch. He looks at the sky and thinks about a son who will not come home. He also thinks about a neighbor who has returned and now needs work that his farm can offer. In a small town in Georgia, a mother unties a bundle of letters and reads a few lines again before putting them away. She thinks about planting and about a new school being discussed at church. In a freedmen's community in Mississippi, families decide where to build houses and how to share tools. They begin to write contracts for work and to plan a school of their own. In Richmond, a carpenter rebuilds a shop front and takes on an apprentice. In Boston, a nurse takes off a hospital apron, folds it carefully, and returns to a classroom, carrying calm strength she learned in the wards. Across the country, people move from war to life. So let the story rest here for tonight. Hear the crickets along a fence line that has been rebuilt. See the moon over a river that once carried gunboats and now carries only reflections. Picture a family at a table, passing bread, speaking softly, and feeling a little more peace than they felt the year before. The war is over. The work of living goes on. And in that work, Steady, patient, and shared, the nation finds its way forward, one day at a time.